Welcome to the Language Fuel podcast. Our mission is to fuel the teaching and learning of languages worldwide. I'm your host, Joanna Smith. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Language Fuel podcast. This is episode number 27. Today, I'm following up on our previous podcast and I'm going to complete the review of Duolingo, which is the app we talked about last time. And this time I want to include some information about what it can't do for language learners. Last time we talked about some great features of the Duolingo app in terms of software design, e-learning features, and second language acquisition ideas. And I do love the app. However, there are some things that it can't do, and I will go into these today by looking at language through a variety of lenses and figuring out exactly what it is that Duolingo is teaching and at the same time recognize what it's not teaching. So I'm going to go from the minute, i.e. phonetics and phonology, the tiny little sounds that are involved in language, and go right up to historical linguistics and sociolinguistics and things like that. So starting off in the area of phonetics, which is individual sounds and how the mouth makes sounds and how the sounds have rules with one another, that's the phonology part of it. Duolingo does not teach any of that. Now they do have some speech recognition features where they ask you to produce the language and compare it to some sort of template that they have in their software. However, there's a whole bunch of other things that I guess in a face-to-face classroom you would be talking about with students. So for example, while the language that we're learning in my family is Spanish together, Duolingo has had to make a choice as to which accent of Spanish or which version or variety of Spanish they are going to use as the target model. Now, I understand that it is the version used in South America or predominantly Mexico, which I suppose is more Central America, or it's still North America, I guess, technically, whatever. But I guess my point is it's not the Spanish version of Spanish as in Spain. And again, even within Mexico, I'm sure there will be different varieties and accents, and certainly in the many other different South American and Central American countries where Spanish is spoken. So, even to have an understanding of some of the differences of the different versions of Spanish is, I guess, interesting. And preparing students for that helps them when they get to reality and visit those places and those language communities and things sound a little different. It'd be good to have had that conversation. And Duolingo doesn't do any of that. Going to another level, looking at morphology, which is if you're aware, the bits and pieces that make up the language, so the suffixes and the prefixes, and in some languages, infixes, which is quite fun to work with if you're not used to that, and how they interact and what they mean. Again, Duolingo does not overtly teach morphological principles. They do, however, include exercises which help you deduct either consciously if you're aware or subconsciously if you're not what those things mean. So an easy example in Spanish, the plural suffix, which is s, similar to English, goes on the noun, but there is suffixes that go on adjectives that modify the noun, and of course the determiners, the words, which also get marked for plural. So I think it's fascinating when I'm looking for it, and I know that the article and the adjective and the noun are all marked for plural, and of course the plural version of the verb, of the stative verb. So I understand that. I'm not sure how much my children would, given that they probably are not necessarily looking for these things. However, being able to use them appropriately or recognize them appropriately is built into the app, where you need to make choices, which determiner goes in this sentence and things like that. So they are acquiring the differences within the Spanish words, but there's no overt explanation as to, what are they doing there? Why are they having to do that? So that's not necessarily a downfall of Duolingo by any, stretch of the imagination. But I guess as someone who does appreciate the systems that are involved in language, I love to talk about this. And, if they were going to learn another language, it would be good for them to be aware of what kinds of things happen in their area. Moving on to the next level that we could look at language, I'm thinking semantics, i.e. meanings. What, meanings do words have, and parts of words and phrases as well. This is something that can be taught quite well in Duolingo, and obviously we're learning many words and understanding their meanings. However, I will say that there is only so much meaning that can be inferred by the translation approach, which is necessary. I mean, it is learning Spanish through English in our case, so there pretty much is a one-to-one assumption. Now, that's not 100% true, because in some situations you can click on a word and it will give you a list of potential ways that you could translate that. So there may be 2 or 3 different words that you could use in English. And I know that in many exercises, when you need to write down an English translation of a word, 2 different alternatives are acceptable. So they have acknowledged the fact that in any language, I'm assuming, there is no one-to-one correspondence, so which is fantastic. However, again, this is not overtly stated, and there's no teaching around how the semantics work, and what is it that makes that word as opposed to the other word. I guess, again, Spanish is a European language, as is English, so it's probably relatively straightforward to use one-to-one or perhaps one-to-two correspondence. But I don't know how the app would handle, say, an Asian language, let's say Japanese and English, where the semantic correlations are much more complex. I haven't tried that out in Duolingo, so I can't comment on that. But the area of meaning and primary meanings, secondary meanings, it's not handled extremely sensitively by the app, and I guess that's not its aim either. So if I were a language teacher using Duolingo as a supplement to my class, I would definitely make some time to teach, subtleties of meaning with some of the words that we're learning. And granted, I'm only at a beginner level using the app myself, so I'm not 100% sure how they handle some more subtle things in more advanced lessons. Looking at another layer or another lens through which you can look at language, syntax. In other words, say at the sentence level, what needs to come first? Is it subject, verb, and then object? Is it verb and then subject to object? That types of things. How are verb phrases structured or split up? Sometimes there's auxiliary verbs and then main verbs. Which comes first? Are there other words that go in between? And that sort of thing. So it's structural things within a sentence. Duolingo handles this very well. In fact, I would say its strength is really sentence level. They don't do one word at a time, although certainly at the beginning you have to, because you've got to start somewhere, but really predominantly they teach sentence by sentence. So the pattern recognition that your brain will automatically do will help you infer those rules, even though they're not necessarily overtly taught. So very good on the syntactic level, at least for Spanish and what I can see. Getting the sentence structure is crucial to getting the activities correct, and you're seeing plenty of examples of sentences, so that's a great thing. Moving on to the next level, which is discourse, and discourse is viewing language from larger chunks at a time. So in writing, you could map out the subject of one sentence. In the next sentence would be replaced by a pronoun, because people don't typically repeat a full noun phrase every time, and that sort of thing. So mapping out how sentences relate to one another, and at the paragraph level and at the discourse level, changing topics in a conversation. What do you say? Well, so, anyway, those kinds of discourse marking words. Now, I have noticed in my use of Duolingo that some of these words are included, and I've seen some words, the equivalent of well in English, start at the beginning of a sentence. So they don't ignore them. They are certainly there. They don't necessarily have much of a meaning within the sentence itself. It is a contextual thing that's lacking, but there is an attempt to include at least discourse markers. But given that they work on sentence by sentence, I'm not sure how they would be able to do any more than simply give a rough translation of what one of those words might mean. So again, if you are teaching sentence by sentence, you'll just naturally miss out on some of the larger level constructions. However, for beginner's level, that's probably perfectly acceptable. Moving on to another wonderful investigation area of language, which is sociolinguistics. How does language affect social groups, or how, perhaps the other way around, how do different social groups affect an individual's language? I mean, there's wonderful, wonderful things to be thought about here. I know myself personally, I speak a little bit different depending on who I'm talking with, where I am in the world, and that has to do with my own personal experience, which groups I identify with, and so on. And it's wonderful to see on a societal level how things like that work. Just really, really super interesting. Even, you might not teach some of the deeper things in a high school classroom, but wonderful things like who actually says words like this. We listened to one podcast in the car one time as a family, again, a beginner level podcast for Spanish, and the person said, here's a word that teenagers use, and it means kind of cool, something like that, or awesome. And so we sort of said to the kids, so probably you could get away with saying a word like that, but mum and dad maybe shouldn't, because we'll be looking like we're trying too hard to be cool. And we had a little laugh, and little things like that, which were texting language. How do you communicate in Spanish when you're texting a friend as opposed to writing an essay? So different contexts of language. None of that comes through in Duolingo. They just don't have the space or the capacity or scope in an app like that, which really does focus on vocabulary and sentence acquisition, to focus on any of the wonderful sociolinguistic features of a language. Moving on again, historical linguistics. I have found it fascinating learning Spanish. It's one of those key, European languages, I guess perhaps the base being Latin, and Latin having influenced English tremendously. So it's, so many different words I recognize from English, and I think, how did this word come to be in English? How did this word come to be in Spanish? When did it change? When did, the Latin change into the different Romance languages in Europe and so on? I find that really interesting. Even my 10-year-old has made some comments. Hey, Mum, this word sounds like such and such in English, which, of course, the meaning might be slightly different, but she's really cottoned on to the fact that they had the same root word at some point from the Latin. So I've been able to pick up on that and say, yes, that's exactly right. Probably the Latin word was such and such. So a little bit of history coming in through there, and I've talked to her about how the language has developed over time. So, I mean, it's just interesting, really fascinating, and I love thinking about that. Duolingo, while it has been a prompt for some of these conversations, it's not able to have those conversations, obviously, with the users of the app. So again, just learning the words and the sentences doesn't allow you to explore with a bit more interest some of the historical things, and political, historical political context in which the language has grown and developed and so on. So again, not a negative at all towards the app. It's just got to focus on something, right? And it's doing a great job on the sentence and word acquisition side, but just missing out on those little interesting features. And finally, thinking about at least the area of psycholinguistics, in this case, perhaps second language acquisition. And what I want to think about is different theories of second language acquisition. There are some very popular ones out there at the moment, including the communicative approach. In other words, situate the activities in your classroom around genuine communication. Provide a context around it, and then the acquisition will happen. When they realize they need to communicate, motivation becomes super high. How do I say this particular thing? That's not what's happening in Duolingo. So if you're super into the communicative approach, you may not like this. There is no communication. It's not two-way at all. There's no context. It's just word by word, sentence by sentence. In some level, a sentence is a broader context for a word, which is, appropriate to learn the syntactical and morphological features of the word, but not really that interactive approach. It's very similar to that is the meaning-based approach. Make sure everything has a super clear meaning before you even teach it. So contextual clues, using videos, using pictures, using realia in your classroom to make the meaning super clear before you introduce the language. Can't do that in an app. There are some pictures, but normally they are just for primary meanings of nouns because that's easy to get a picture for. So yeah, missing out on all of that. There's a wonderful book by Jill Hadfield on motivating language learning, and they talk about helping the learner get into a second language identity and develop that identity as a speaker of the language. But again, you can't really get into all those sorts of things through simply playing an app. So even just looking at those three approaches to language learning, you could say, well, Duolingo fails on all of those things. But what's the point of having those approaches to second language acquisition? The point is to help increase the acquisition itself. So if you're using the actual acquisition as a measure as to whether or not the app is successful, I have to say it is successful. It's successful in its own way. As far as an app can go, the motivation comes not from communicating or from the meaning-based approach or from a motivational identity approach. It comes from gaming, from gamification of the app itself. So this is something that you can do in an app that is a little bit more difficult to achieve in a classroom. Now, I'm the first person to say I love playing games in my classroom, so gamification is not new, but the app does it extremely well. So it is motivating, and language acquisition is happening. I think Duolingo tells me regularly how many words I have acquired, and again, vocabulary acquisition is only one measure of acquisition, but I think I'm up to about 250 or getting close up to 300. And I didn't have those words before, so somehow I know them now. I know them in their sentences. Having said that, if you were to transport me today to a Spanish-speaking country and put me on the corner of a street and told me to go buy my groceries, I might struggle a little because I would have to try to remember what the words are. I may not have practice in speaking fast or listening to fast, authentic communication. And as I mentioned before, there may be accent differences that I have not been exposed to. So, the reality is, have I acquired it? On some level, yes, and on some level, no. So that's pretty much all I can say. I think it is a fantastic app. My kids are still gung-ho, enjoying learning. We're enjoying learning as a group together, but it's not perfect. I think it's a wonderful supplement for a class where you can do all these other things, but it still needs to be supplemented, I think, with some of these other things. So teachers, you're doing a great job. You're never going to be replaced entirely. You still have a wonderful role to play, but do make use of some of these things like Duolingo. It can really enhance what you're doing already in the classroom. That's it from me today. Ka kite. See you next time. Thank you for listening to the Language Fuel podcast. You can navigate to the show notes and links via our homepage at www.languagefuel.com. See you next time.